Here we have the Westlake B2 air rifle. It's a sprung-loaded rifle, and today we're going to strip it down and we're going to have a look at what the home mechanic could repair in the workshop. And here we're just removing a small locating screw that helps to keep the pin for the brake barrel assembly in place. So here we are just removing the pin, and in this case I'm going to put it in a magnetic tray. And now it's just a case of removing the parts from the main cylinder there. And here, by using some G-clamps and an old car jack, I've tried to make a setup where I'll be able to safely remove the pin from the trigger that holds the whole of the spring assembly in place. And then in the block of wood I drilled that hole, which I would then be able to tap the pin through and into. But first I had to release the brake barrel release catch. And again, put that somewhere safe in your magnetic tray. So here it was a case of just applying some light pressure with the clamp to keep everything in position before removing the pin, which is also linked into the trigger assembly. Now on these jobs you're sometimes learning on the go. So the pin was now pushed through but not fully out. You can see the trigger there has just been taken away, but the pin is still left half in. And it's always a concern when you've got a spring that is under some tension in a body, which is just about being held onto by half a pin. So having removed the pin and taken the tension away, I was still surprised to think, why is this thing not coming apart? What it was basically the friction inside that fit that was holding it all together, or it had partially seized. So having given it a gentle tap with a punch, it then came free. You can see there we've got some spring tension, and with the end cap being released we could get to the internals, the spring and the spring guide and the piston head. So here we are now, just removing the spring and the spring guide. And then the next process, this was a bit trickier than I actually thought it should have been. It was quite well and truly stuck in there. And to get the piston head assembly out, I had to do quite a little bit of tapping there to move it forward and encourage it down the cylinder. And so with any kind of service and strip down, it's always a good idea to give things a good clean, a good wipe down, and have a thorough inspection. You can see there that the piston is actually in quite good condition. So let's have a look at the pieces. On the left we have the trigger housing and the end cap. Then we have the spring guide, the spring, the cylinder and the main body there, with the piston head and then the actual piston itself all stripped down into the various components. So let's have a look at the actual piston itself and assemble it again, having given it a nice cleaning. Now there's several little washers that you can insert, and you've got a countersunk screw with a countersunk washer as well. And that fibre washer goes on the back. And having looked at the piston head body a bit closer, I decided to file it a bit more and clean it up, because some of the edges on there just didn't look quite smooth enough. So having given things a nice clean and some general greasing, it was time to look at the trigger, and it's quite a cheaply made affair. As you can see there, you've got the two mechanisms that latch onto each other, and I could see there that maybe over time, if the trigger rod end and the sear on the trigger started to wear, it would cause some problems. And that's where you may have to start to file things back or to start to get mini grinding tools and get straight edges re-established. So here we are now on the next stage of reassembly. So we apply a little bit of grease on the inside of the cylinder just to make it easier for the piston to go inside. However, this became more of a challenge than I expected. So to overcome this problem, I used a bore scraping tool just to allow a nice chamfered edge which would help lead in the piston. It was then given a clean with some fine grade wet and dry. And then we used a magnet just to remove any metal debris that was left inside there, and then one more final clean before trying to reassemble it all again. So here we are now just refitting the whole of the piston assembly, and again it was quite a tight fit, but with some gentle persuasion it went in quite well, and they're just making sure it's gliding nicely within the cylinder. This is the spring guide again, just giving that a nice bit of grease and lubrication. In this case I'm using a Teflon based grease which I use on my bike parts. And here's the main spring. It's already been cleaned, and I give it a nice light greasing, ready for the final assembly. This is the trigger housing and the spring end block, but if we focus here on the highlighted part, that's where your trigger spring will locate into later on in the final assembly. Now this next stage of fitting the spring back in place was actually quite tricky. And here I'm using a car jack and a clamped piece of wood, and you've always got to remember that things under tension and pressure are potentially very dangerous, so if you want to try this at home, I would do this at your own risk. And a crucial part of aligning the trigger up inside this assembly is to use a small punch as a guide to allow the pin to go through the trigger plates, and there are 3 of them, and again this can be quite a fiddly process. The general principle of this spring is quite a simple idea, and fitting it just takes a bit of patience, and you might need a couple of screwdrivers just to help guide it and to move it into position. Just be careful that you don't strain it or bend it. And it's not a substantial spring, and you wouldn't want to be damaging it or deforming it, which would compromise its action. And with all moving parts and any bearing surfaces like this, linkages etc, it's always important to give them a nice bit of grease, and especially with a trigger mechanism you want the action to be as smooth as you can make it. One of the main problems with this rifle was the breech seal, and in this case it was a leather one which had severely perished. And a worn breech seal will have a detrimental impact on any rifle's performance. So back in the workshop it was a case of cleaning and making good, and then trying to make one with whatever materials I had in my toolbox. And I found a rubber washer which looked ideal. However, it would need splicing and trimming to size with a Stanley knife. And although this wasn't an ideal fix, it played to my advantage because under close inspection the machine body between the barrel and the breech wasn't concentric. So here you can see I'm shaving off pieces at angles which compensate for this misalignment. And after some gentle persuasion and light tapping with a hammer and a punch, the new seal started to take shape, and it was actually looking pretty good when we take into account I never actually had an off-the-shelf part to fit. And here is the end result, and if we freeze the frame here you can actually see where there is misalignment around that body. But we've now recreated a seal, which is better than the original one. And so after all of this maintenance, it's now time to put the rifle back together again. Well, that brings this workshop session to a close today. But if you like these videos and they do help you, please let me know and I'll make some more for you. And if you'd like to know more about how I customise the stock, please check out the video on my YouTube channel. And thank you for watching.